yourself on mute.
All right, thanks, Jay. Just doing a quick audio check. It seems to be a little bit better right now. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Jay. My name is Jordan Bass. I'm the coordinator for research services and digital strategies here at the University of Manitoba Libraries. Andrea, just a quick introduction from yourself.
Hi, I'm Andrea Szwajcer. As Jay said, I'm the Research Services Librarian in the same unit as Jordan, and we're looking forward to speaking to you today on the DM policy.
Thanks, Andrea. So this morning, Andrea and I will give an overview of the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy. We anticipate there'll be many questions, or we hope there will be, at the end of the presentation, and we would ask that you keep those questions to the end. Andrea and I will monitor the chat box, so if you have a question, please enter it in there. Just also note this session is being recorded. And with that, I'll jump right into it. Okay. Sorry, Andrea, next slide. I'll do the acknowledgement. I should start that, sorry. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So some quick preamble from the tri-agencies. The agencies expect the research they fund to be conducted to the highest professional and disciplinary standards domestically and internationally. These standards support research excellence by ensuring that research is performed ethically and makes good use of public funds, and research results are accessible as possible. Research data management, or RDM, the acronym we'll use throughout, is a necessary part of research excellence. The agencies furthermore believe that research data collected through the use of public funds should be responsibly and securely managed and be, where ethical, legal, and commercial obligations allow, available for reuse by others. So as for the components, there are three core components we'll be reviewing this morning, the first of which is the institutional strategy. So each post-secondary institution eligible to administer CIHR, NSERC, or SSHRC funds is required to create an institutional RDM strategy and notify the agencies when it has been completed. The strategy must be made publicly available on the institution's website with contact information to which inquiries about the strategy can be directed. Having the strategies publicly available will help the agencies and the broader research community to understand the institution's current and planned RDM capacity, challenges and needs, and will facilitate ongoing dialogue and collaboration on the advancement of RDM in Canada. And this first requirement is expected on March 1, 2023. The second component, and we'll get a little bit more into this one later on, data management plans. All grant proposals submitted to the agencies should include methodologies that reflect best practices in RDM. For certain funding opportunities, the agencies will require data management plans to be submitted to the appropriate agency at the time of application, as outlined in the calls for proposals. In these cases, the DMPs will be considered in the adjudication process, and that is expected as a requirement for spring 2022. And finally, the third component, data deposit. Grant recipients are required to deposit into a digital repository all digital research data, metadata, and code that directly support the research conclusions and journal publications and preprints that arise from agency-supported research. Determining what counts as relevant research data and which data should be preserved is often highly contextual and should be guided by disciplinary norms. The deposit must be made by time of publication. The choice of repository may be guided by disciplinary expectations and the recipient's own judgment, but in all cases, the repository must ensure safe storage, preservation, and curation of the data. Data deposit will be reviewed by the tri-agencies after the institutional strategies have been completed. However, many researchers are already depositing their data in repositories, and that will continue. Data deposit is also a key element of any data management plan. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the institutional strategy and what this means. The strategy, which is again made publicly available, must include information on how the institution will support researchers in meeting compliance frameworks. It will promote data management to researchers, staff, and students. It will demonstrate guidance and adoption of data management best practices. It will support access to data management services throughout the research lifecycle. It also recognizes that data created in the context of research by and with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities will be managed according to the principles developed and approved by those communities and in partnership with them. Next slide. The new Digital Research Infrastructure Organization, or INDRIO, has released an institutional strategy template. Research universities across Canada are in various stages of preparedness, while work on developing these strategies is understandably ramping up. We'll probably return to that in the question period, but for the next component, I will hand it off to you, Andrea.
So data management plans. This is just the overview of what a data management plan does. So it describes how data will be collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved, how existing data sets will be used, and what new data will be created, whether and how data will be shared, where data will be deposited. Overarching all of these concepts will be roles and responsibilities involved in the production and management of the research, succession plans for that research products, any and all ethical, legal, commercial constraints, considerations, and frameworks that inform that data. We have been supporting data management plans for the last few years. So the status of the support is ongoing. Consultation and training is available upon request. And we've conducted several online open education sessions. We're moving towards more targeted support. And resources including a link to DMP Assistant is available. The DMP Assistant platform, which is national and indeed international, open to anyone to register, was upgraded to 2.0 in early March. I should also say that this platform is supported and created by Portage and Andrea. Versioning and other functionality is now available. DMP Assistant Institution Management is now available via dashboard. So what that means is that there are two administrators, myself and Jordan, who have access sort of to the back end of the institutional information for DMP Assistant. And we will be working on developing customized templates emerging from DMP expert group, which is an expert group of Portage and Andrea, and customizing that to the University of Manitoba milieu. And finally, in terms of data deposit, data and corresponding documentation that directly supports research described in publication is to be deposited into a digital repository. We would like to emphasize at this point, directly supports research described in publication. And we're happy to talk about that further if there's questions. Deposit is to be made at the time of publication. Choice of repository is at the researcher's discretion. Deposit is distinct from sharing. We would like to emphasize this. There is no obligation to make any or all data open. However, researchers are expected to adhere to FAIR principles whenever possible. Finally, data deposit stipulations will be exempted or in accordance with the guidance from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities for research conducted by and with these communities. Like DMP Assistant plans, our support is ongoing and has been for a while. Consultation and training is available upon request. Resources for deposit is available, and here's the links. University of Manitoba Libraries supports deposit, including Dataverse, is available for de-identified data deposit from all REBs. You can see the exception here at this time. So FDR is the Federated Research Data Repository supported by Portage and Andrea. It is available for, quote, big data, so data sets larger than 5 gigabytes that can be open, i.e. de-identified, not restricted or closed. They are currently working with the sensitive expert group of Portage and other stakeholders to work to develop a sensitive data repository aspect of FDR. Here is some background information on some of the acronyms that we have discussed here in this presentation. And we have done several related education presentations on various topics that are mentioned in data management plans. For your information, our contact information is here, and we're happy to take questions at this time.
All right, thank you, Andrea and Jordan, and I see Brian Krasinski's had his hand up for a little bit, so go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so there are a few systems that you mentioned fairly quickly that many of us will not be familiar with. DMP Assistant I've never heard of, and in fact I've never heard of any of the ones you had on. There's a slide, there was one on the slide for very large secure data sets. Could you quickly tell us what each of these is, who uses them, and what they use them for?
So I can speak to, Andrea, I'll start with Dataverse in terms of talking about a repository. Right now, the University of Manitoba has a number of what we call data repositories. One of the largest is Dataverse. We've been using that for about 4 years. At present, there's about 111 research projects in there, representing between 11 and 13 faculties here at the U of M. That's one repository. The other repository, Andrea noted, is the Federated Research Data Repository. So that's the big national federal government one, in addition to a number of others. One at Bannatyne, the Secure Research Environment, as well as some discipline-specific ones. In terms of DMP Assistant, Andrea, did you want to give an overview of that?
Sure. So that is not a data deposit repository. That is the platform that supports data management plans. So you set up an account there. You can have access to templates, whether those are Portage templates or University of Manitoba developed templates. You can proceed to set up your data management plan. You can share them with any of your research team. You can export it in many different formats. And the idea is that, which I think has yet to be fully fleshed out by the tri-agency, but the desired plan for each grant will be available on that platform. And the idea is that the researcher would go in, they would select a template that would reflect their needs for that data, for that grant submission. You would fill out the DMP, and then you would submit it as part of a grant submission. It's very similar to other funders. So if for those who may be familiar with American grant funders, such as NIH, National Defense Plan grants, those also require a completion of templates designed by those funders and is available on DMP Tool. So that's the American equivalent of DMP Assistant. So I assume the process will be somewhat reflective of those precursors.
So to follow up then, the DMP assistant is something every PI would use. They would have a data plan, and that would be somehow submitted as part of applications. So that seems straightforward now. The Dataverse, is that primarily a document repository, or does it include elements, let's say, of a relational database?
Basically what Dataverse is it's a format agnostic repository. So you can upload just about any type of file format, but you cannot open those files in the Dataverse environment. It's just to store, transfer, and then provide access to. So if you have a large database, that's not something you would upload to Dataverse. Likewise, any kind of software wouldn't be uploaded to Dataverse. It's just the output. And again, it's not everything that goes in there. So, you can certainly use Dataverse as an active research environment, but there is some heavy computing research that Dataverse isn't a good candidate for, and that's where the other repositories will come in.
Are there other questions? York?
Jorge, go ahead.
Okay.
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. A couple of quick questions here. Just to confirm, the DMPs are going to be required, as you said, the timeline is by spring 2022, right? That's when in the calls from SHERC, for example, this will appear in that we have to include the data management plan. Okay. The second question has to do with the question of data deposit, right? So, and this is where maybe people in the sciences are more familiar with this, because if you are involved in medicine or hard science, probably this is more the kind of things that are already in place, what can you share, how you can share. It's more difficult for the humanities and the arts, right, about what you can share or not, right? When you do research, in private archives, or for example, or something like that, you are limited to what you can share. And so there seems to be, according to what you presented, some flexibility. So on the one hand, there's a requirement to put the stuff there accessible, about the material you have collected and so on. But there's also some flexibility there. Can you speak more about this, or the implications of this for this kind of humanities arts, in terms of the deposit part of the DMP?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a part of that, Andrea, then if you want to just add. So I think in terms of when researchers are being required to deposit their research material, we recognize that some disciplines will use primarily secondary sources. So that's certainly not something you're going to deposit into a repository. You may provide links to that in the publication if it's another external repository or online, source. In terms of primary research, it's very similar. So if you're doing archival research, taking digital photos of, say, an older manuscript or something, that's not something you're going to be able to deposit in Dataverse as well, right? So there are going to be cases where there won't be much to deposit, if anything. Tri-agencies have not been very clear, last time I checked, and what happens when there are researchers who do receive, for example, a SHERC grant, a SHERC Insight grant or something like that, may not have anything to deposit. It may be more linking to, repository, archive, external to. We're hoping to get more clarity on that. I think as we go through these presentations, Andrea and I are kind of collecting information, and we'll be seeking more details on stuff just like this. And you're certainly not the first to ask.
I just wanted to follow up on a few things that Jordan said. Going back to the slides, deposit is different than sharing. Okay, so for materials that are restricted or closed, you can still deposit. So in fact, we have many data sets in Dataverse that is either restricted or closed. Okay, so deposit is for preservation. It is not necessarily for sharing. Okay, so really want us to emphasize that, and happy to talk more about the nuances of sharing in a second. In terms of deposit, you can deposit secondary sources and make it completely closed. However, if you are going to share, there are several considerations around sharing. Okay, so the first off is that if you're sharing secondary data sources and they are subject to licenses, it is incumbent on the researcher to understand what those licenses are. So for example, if the secondary data source has a CC by SA license assigned, then your data set that is deposited and shared will de facto have a CC by SA assigned because it is a share alike license. So you are obligated under that license to also have that share alike assignment. Okay, so understanding around data licenses is under our presentation here, sharing in Creative Commons. So invite you, anyone who has questions around licenses and Creative Commons licenses and interpretations of those licenses to avail themselves of that presentation. And happy to talk more about that. In terms of sharing, when you make a deposit, and this is where DMPs come in, it's so important, is the reason why Tri-Agency is asking for data management plans is to encourage researchers to think very much upstream in terms of what is required in your data. And that means in terms of REB submissions, if you are anticipating that you will need to deposit as part of publication, that you are specifying that up front, and you have indicated that in terms of secondary use requirements statement in your consent. And similar to, and then if you do not require an REB submission, still an understanding of what can be shared and what governs that sharing, you know, in terms of Indigenous communities that you've had that conversation, whether they will be sharing with whatever auspices that they use. That's all part of the plan, all part of your understanding and expectation around sharing. So I think I'll leave it there. I imagine we'll have more questions about this. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes, we do have two more hands up, Jonathan Regier and then Phil Ferguson.
Good morning, and thanks for the conversation this morning. I have a question about the relationship between researcher, I'll say, owned servers or servers at the department level sometimes, and sort of the university level Dataverse and other repositories, and I'm wondering how those things interact relative to the tri-agency policies. So if, for example, I have my own server, is that a sufficient data repository, and how that kind of plays with the tri-agency requirements and requirements of various journal publications? Thanks.
I can speak to that a little bit. We do recognize that a lot of researchers will kind of run their own, network attached storage, servers. Likewise, they might be using a third-party service that, isn't on premises. Like that's just the way it is. At the same time, I think what Tri-Agencies is trying to articulate here is more rigorous data management. So when they say recognized data repository, that repository should have certain, security protocols in place, should have certain features. There should be retention disposition guidelines. So for example, a Dataverse will be going through a certification process, a formal certification process for it this coming year. and that's to just kind of bolster the integrity and reliability of the repository, so it's long term. So if you're thinking about a departmental server, you really have to think, I guess, about long-term preservation in that case, and how it's going to be supported. For example, if you're the PI and you depart university for whatever reason, there should be a succession plan. So there's just a lot of policy procedure around a recognized repository that some departments may not have, some research groups may not have. Again, Andrea, you might want to add a little bit to that in terms of maybe third party beyond FERDR. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so as the first questioner mentioned, science is very familiar with data deposit. There are many established repositories out there that are discipline specific. Physics have done this for many years, in fact. And so there are recognized repositories out there, 2,800, I think, and counting. And they're all in what's called Open Door. So Open Door, DOAR, is essentially a registry of repositories. And so Dataverse is just the institutional repository for data deposit. But if you feel that your audience is better served by depositing your data in a recognized repository for your research, then that's where you deposit. And then you just show demonstration of deposit by by either the funder or the publisher. So we're not making stipulations, and certainly the tri-agency is not making stipulations about where deposit occurs. We're just we're ensuring that we have infrastructure to support those people who don't have a particular repository in mind. And also to provide preservation strategy for research, because you can always deposit in more than one repository so long as your requirements and your licenses and everything else that informs your data includes that. So, a secure environment resource is not necessarily a repository, right? It is an active storage facility to actuate research in the active research phase, but they're not designed for long-term preservation considerations, right? So, Jordan and Natalie are experts at the University of Manitoba in terms of preservation. And we have certain auspices that we are currently going through in terms of certification to provide that authority to, as there are dynamic changes in information science right now, where there are funders and other things that are trying to make directives in terms of what is considered authoritative deposit sources. So that's maybe hopefully the difference or the distinction that you see between, like, in your question, I hope.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Phil?
Yeah, thanks. To what extent will this be applied retroactively, or wait for projects currently and moving forward?
I think there's some uncertainty on that, but in terms of it being retroactive, I think that would be very difficult. That being said, if we're talking about the three components, the institutional strategy, that doesn't factor in here. Data management plans, it would be a good idea to have them, even if your research is currently active. But in terms of data deposit, we still don't know when that's going to be made a requirement, right? It's still speaking about, that's down the road. The first requirement is data management planning. Andrea, do you have some experience with people who have kind of done this, data management planning during the active phase?
Yeah, so it's been made clear to us that data management plans will only be required for new submissions to grants starting in 2022, whatever those grants have been identified as requiring a DMP. However, we have several researchers who are currently working with us to develop, sort of become champions around data management plans in their faculties. And so they're currently working through a DMP to reflect their own research project, just as to get a feel for what a data management plan requires, information. And some of that information you have, and some of that information you may have in your head, but you've never kind of written it down. So it's never a bad time to complete a DMP, if only to get a feel for how to fill one out. And we're happy to sort of talk more about that. But in terms of sort of retroactive, that there will be no retroactive application in terms of a DMP or a data deposit. But with one proviso with a data deposit, it's not just funders that ask, it will not be just tri-agency that asks for deposit. Depending on where you have published, for example, PLOS, they ask for proof of a data deposit or justification why deposit can't happen. And so sometimes if researchers have not anticipated that ask, it really throws researchers off. So we're really trying to encourage that, again, upstream considerations around deposits, so you're not sort of caught off guard and then having more work created for yourself to try and answer that ask.
And yeah, one quick follow-up
Okay,
on
thank
too. Like I mentioned earlier, there's about 111 research projects in our Dataverse right now. Some of those were deposited 5 years ago. So there's been a kind of a continuous uploading of content to Dataverse, even without tri-agency requiring it. So it's always there. And again, it's a good option if you want to get it out of maybe a third-party service or even just out of your local network. It's available.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Lynn, you're up next.
Hi, I have a comment and then a question. My first comment is just with respect to the comments you made regarding sort of anticipating in the future what you're going to need regarding data and data use and data deposit in terms of what the researchers include in their REB submission, and in particular in the informed consent form. And I want to, as the person who does look at those informed consent forms in connection with review of research contracts, I think that's something that really should be stressed. I think it's important that they do consider what is going to happen to the data, so that in order to ensure that it is a valid informed consent, we have clearly stated in the informed consent document what is going to happen with the data, and so they don't run into problems later when they need to be able to deposit or do something with it, so that's consistent with what we've told people. So that's sort of my comment. And then my question is related to research involving Indigenous communities. You touched on that a little bit, and I'm wondering if you can expand on it in terms of like what sort of exceptions might be made. Because I know in a lot of the contracts that we work on with Indigenous communities, very much the issue is with respect to that data and what our researchers are allowed to do with the data, which is often very limited in the sense of the Indigenous community owns, controls, does everything with the data. Like we often have, this is one of the struggles when we negotiate these agreements, the research contracts, we often aren't able to get a lot of rights. So has there been a lot of work done in that area, or discussion in terms of these DMPs and the requirement to deposit data with those communities?
Andrea and I can both take this one. I think first, thanks, Lynn. I think you made a really good point in terms of data sharing and anticipating data sharing needs. In terms of working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, I think you're right. If you look at just even First Nations OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and possession, it's quite understandable that some of this research data will not be deposited in something like Dataverse. It will not be made accessible. through something like Dataverse or any other repository. I don't know that I have any specific examples of how this would work within this policy. I think there are research groups right now that are already working with Indigenous communities that have set up, different data sharing agreements according to, traditional knowledge. There's TK licensing for some online repositories, but there's still some unknowns about what's going to be required for quote unquote deposit in that situation. Andrea, anything to add?
So just nothing much further other than I sit on the Data Management Plan Assistant Steering Committee for Portage Andrea, and I'm aware that there are Indigenous representatives both both in our steering committee and other Portage expert groups that are working to assist Portage and Drio in terms of navigating expectations around deposit. The First Nations Information Governance Organization has sort of set up their own sort of closed repository deposit environment to support their own communities in terms of ownership and governance for their own communities for research that sort of come out of collaborations. So that, as we sort of said from the outset, those of course supersede any types of deposit offerings or repository requirements that are stipulated anywhere else.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cyrus, you're up next.
Hello, thank you for the presentation today. I have a question about the Dataverse timelines on it. I was reading the fact page, and it has normally the data will be stored up to 7 years, with a comment on longer, I guess, for research ethics boards, certain types of files. But I guess in terms of data storage, what is the tri-agency expecting? I mean, do they want more than 7 years? Will Dataverse compensate if, NSERC or SHRC says it should be stored for 50 years? Well, what do we do after a certain time limit?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Cyrus. And that's something we've been grappling with beyond Dataverse. So right now, when we use that 7-year retention period, we use that as kind of just a stock retention, right? For most research, 5 to 7 years. Start talking about clinical trials, that's into the 35-year range. But what we kind of envision here with retention in Dataverse is that, say if you do a research project, you go through REB and you say, I'm going to be storing my data for X amount of years, at which point it will be either preserved or destroyed. That's usually the way it goes. If it is going to be preserved, what will probably have to happen in that scenario, certainly within libraries, is that it will be moved out of Dataverse into what we maybe call deep storage, right? So we'd run it through basically a software application we have called Archivematica to create an archival information package, and it's stored, preserved. It's not made accessible. It's very similar maybe to what IST does with, there's the active research phase with data, and then sometimes when it doesn't need to be readily accessible, it's moved to deep storage in those cases. There isn't any specifics on long-term preservation with this policy. I think what they're primarily looking at is just, again, that active research window, post-research being, let's say, 7 years, at which point some of that data will be made accessible permanently, just different levels of it, while other components of that research will be preserved, not within Dataverse as a repository. There's still a lot to hammer out, Cyrus, in terms of retention and disposition, but data will not be sitting in Dataverse forever. It will have to move out eventually.
Could I ask one more question?
Of course.
By all means, there are no other hands up.
Okay, thanks. In terms of storage of data, now, are we talking about this on a per project basis or per, let's say, professor basis? And the reason I'm asking is, over the years, I'm going to have 50 graduate students, 10 different research projects. Do I have to set up let's say, a Dataverse account on a per project basis, each with their own passwords and everything, or could I just have one for myself?
We've done it both ways, to be honest. We do have some, PIs that do want to separate them. Like basically what it is, you can set up a project in Dataverse. It'll just say you're the PI for everything. So we have those scenarios, and it's kind of just subdirectories, and there's ways to arrange that within that repository, any repository for that matter. Other PIs will want to separate it and have project A, Dataverse project. So that's its own space in the repository with its own grad students, its own levels. There's different permission settings, stuff like that, and then they'll maybe start a separate one. It all really depends, and again, that's going to vary depending on where you deposit, right? Like Dataverse is just one, but depending on where you go, there might be different rules. It's hard to pin down.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? We have till 11 o'clock, so we still have a lot of time available to take additional questions if people have them.
I think there's questions about providing the presentation afterwards, and we're happy to do that.
Okay, Fenton, go ahead.
Hi there. I just want to follow up on the previous question. Will we be responsible for our graduate students' data in perpetuity, or will a graduate student create their own account and manage their own data?
Again, I'll just speak to Dataverse. I can't speak for all repositories, but what we kind of require right now with the Dataverse is that the PI requests the creation of that space in the Dataverse environment. They act as the administrator for all users within there. So if you have grad students, RAs, uploading data to Dataverse or manipulating it in any way, the PI is kind of responsible for succession planning. So that grad student departs, the PI/administrator still has to be the primary custodian of that data long term.
Just one follow-up to that. From research ethics governed research, there's still no sort of official policy, and I know nationally there's some conversations around this. This is kind of early days, I guess. But you have to show proof of consent if you're going to deposit in archival material. So to that end, while we're requesting for those who indicate deposit indications and REB submissions that at least a copy of the consent form where you have demonstrated proof of consent be retained by the advisor, i.e. the consents are not taken away by the graduate student upon graduation, that at least that there is a copy of the consent form with the advisors for material that are deposited in Dataverse, so that we at least have some evidence that consent was obtained for deposits.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone else? We're good for time if you are. All right, I am not seeing any additional questions, and Jordan has commented that the presentation will be available after. Where's it posted, Jordan, or how's it going out?
We've got a list generated here through Teams, so I can maybe do it just through email and provide a link.
Do a circulation that way. Oh, okay, Brian's put his hand back up again. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I've been going through the Dataverse guide here, and the one thing that I can't seem to find is reference to if you are making a data set available publicly, totally open, and in fact, you would like to use Dataverse as the place that you cite in your publication, go to this link to get this piece of data. It's not obvious that that can be done in Dataverse, or how would you get the URL
Right.
to put in your publication to do that?
Yeah, you know what? That's we're working on making that a little clearer, but I can explain it to you. It's a good question. What basically happens in that situation, Brian, is you can deposit in Dataverse, and there's an option to what's called publish. So if you have a data set, you'll publish it. It's an option to publish. And what happens at that point is that data set or object gets assigned a DOI, a direct object identifier that's minted through DataCite. And that's the link you provide to your publication. So yeah, but again, that's probably not as clear as it should be on the site. So thank you.
Anyone else?
I just want to also say that this recording will also be available on the library's YouTube channel. So if, for those who want to watch the recording for the questions, that's where the recording will be.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for spending some time to us today, but in particular, I want to thank Andrea and Jordan for their presentation and their expertise in this area. And of course, if questions arise after the fact, I'm sure either one of them are happy to receive an email and provide a response. So with that, I'll encourage everyone to stay safe, and thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, bye-bye now.